Today, the shores of Lake Turkana look quiet. The wind moves across the water, the sun burns through the haze, and the land seems timeless. But hidden beneath this calm surface lies the oldest evidence of something we thought came much later: war. 10,000 years ago, before farming, before cities, before written history, a group of humans stood on this same ground and turned on each other. It was not a skirmish or a hunt gone wrong. It was a massacre. Men, women, and children struck down by their own kind. Bound hands, shattered skulls, obsidian blades buried in bone. Long before empires and borders, people were already fighting for water, for land, for survival. What happened here rewrites everything we thought we knew about peace and progress. Because if war existed before civilization, then maybe violence is not something we invented. Maybe it has always been with us, waiting in the same minds that built tools and shared fires. The same brains that painted caves and raised families also learned how to plan ambushes and take life. Lake Turkana is one of the oldest mirrors of our species. It has seen us rise, adapt, and destroy. It remembers what we have forgotten, that the first battlefield was not fought for gold or glory, but for survival beside a shrinking lake. And in that reflection lies a question we still have not answered. If this forgotten war was the beginning, how close are we now to writing its sequel? If you are using these videos to relax or fall asleep, that's literally why I make them. So subscribe maybe and tell me where you are watching from. I always check the comments. It's wild seeing people from everywhere at once. Nairobi at noon, Toronto past midnight. All of us here together, still standing on the same ancient shore. You know that strange stillness you feel standing beside a lake when the wind dies and the water turns to glass. The air goes quiet. The surface reflects the sky perfectly. And for a second it feels like the world is holding its breath. That is what Lake Turkana feels like today. Calm, endless, beautiful. But under that silence, beneath the green, grey waves, lies one of the darkest secrets in human history. Not a legend, not a myth, but something carved into bone. Thousands of years ago, this place was nothing like it is now. The desert that surrounds Turkana today was once green, thick with grass and trees, crowded with animals. Hippos rolled in the shallows. Birds clouded the sky. The people who lived here had everything they could want: water, food, shelter. It should have been paradise. So why do we find bodies here, not buried with care, but scattered and broken as if time itself froze in the middle of a nightmare? In 2012, scientists were digging near the western shore when they noticed something strange. Fragments of bone mixed with shards of black, glassy stone. The bones were old, older than any known village or kingdom. They belonged to hunter-gatherers, people who lived long before cities or armies or kings. At first, it looked like the remains of a small group caught in some accident, maybe a flood or a storm. But as the excavation continued, the truth began to surface. These people did not die by chance. They were killed. One man was found face down, with his hands bound together. Another had a skull crushed by a blunt object. A woman lay beside him, heavily pregnant, her body pierced by an obsidian blade. Children's bones were mixed in with adults, their tiny skeletons shattered. Whoever did this left them where they fell, unburied, unclaimed. It was not hunting, it was not ritual, it was violence. Organized, intentional, and cold. This discovery at a place now called Nataruk shocked everyone. Until then, many scientists believed early humans only started fighting wars after they settled into farms and built property lines. But this site was 10,000 years old. long before agriculture, long before walls or kings or borders. It meant that human conflict, the kind that leaves no survivors, began far earlier than anyone thought. It meant that war was not invented by civilization. It may have been born with us. Imagine it. The world was young. No cities, no armies, just small groups of people moving across a fertile land. Yet even in that world of abundance, something drove one group to destroy another. Was it fear, revenge, territory, or something darker? The bones cannot answer, but they whisper a story older than history itself. A story about the first time humans turned their weapons not on animals, but on each other. The forgotten war of Lake Turkana is more than an archaeological mystery. It is a mirror. When we look into that still green water, we are not just seeing the past. We are seeing the reflection of what it means to be human, and the warning that even paradise can become a battlefield. 10,000 years ago, the land around Lake Turkana was alive. The air was thick with the buzz of insects and the cries of birds. The lake stretched wide like an inland sea, shining blue under the African sun. Fish darted through the shallows, hippos snorted in the reeds, crocodiles slid quietly through the channels that branched like veins across the delta. Herds of antelope grazed the grassy plains, while elephants and giraffes wandered between acacia trees. It was not the dry, cracked earth we see today. It was green, generous, overflowing with life. This was a place where no one should have gone hungry, a paradise carved out of time itself. Along these shores lived groups of early humans. They were hunter-gatherers, moving with the rhythm of the seasons, following herds, fishing the rivers, gathering fruits and roots. They built small camps near the water, weaving baskets, shaping tools from obsidian and bone. They laughed, told stories, raised children, and watched storms roll across the horizon. Life was hard, yes, but it was steady. There were no cities, no kings, no armies, only small bands of people who depended on each other to survive. From a distance, it sounds simple, almost peaceful, but beneath that calm surface, tension was building. The lake that gave them life was also a magnet for competition. Every group needed access to water and fish. Every group needed space to hunt and gather. As the climate began to shift, rain became less predictable, and green turned slowly to gold, then to dust. What had once been enough for everyone was no longer enough. Camps began to drift closer together, and the line between neighbour and rival began to blur. The same hands that shaped obsidian blades for hunting soon used them for something else. If you stood by the lake back then, you would see the signs of plenty and the seeds of danger all at once. The laughter of children playing near the water, the rhythmic pounding of stone against stone as someone shaped a weapon, the smell of cooking fish mixed with the heavy air before a storm. It would look like peace, but it would feel like pressure. You would sense that something was about to give, because when people have something worth keeping, they also have something worth fighting for. What makes this story haunting is the paradox. The first known war in human history did not happen in a wasteland. It happened in a garden. These were people surrounded by beauty, by abundance, by everything they could possibly need. Yet in that abundance, they found a reason to kill. Maybe it was fear that someone else would take what they had. Maybe it was revenge for a raid or a stolen resource. Or maybe it was the simple, tragic fact that humans, even then, could not stand to share paradise for long. Today the lake still glows under the sun, its surface quiet, its shores lonely. But beneath that calm, the ghosts of those first communities rest, reminders that even the greenest horizon can hide the oldest darkness in us all. Imagine walking across the dry plains near Lake Turkana and seeing the glint of something in the dust. At first it looks like a rock, just another fragment of ancient ground. But as you brush away the sand, a shape begins to form. A curve, a hollow, a human skull, then another and another. Some are cracked, some are crushed, and beside them lie stone blades, sharp as the day they were made. The site is called Nataruk, and what lies there is not just a grave, it is a frozen moment in time, a massacre preserved by accident and silence for 10,000 years. Archaeologists found them as they fell. Men, women, even children. Their bones scattered across the shore of what was once a shallow lagoon. There were no burial mounds, no care, no sign of mourning. One man's wrists were still bound together, his arms twisted behind his back. Another lay face down, his skull shattered by a heavy blow. A woman's ribs were cracked, her body pierced by an obsidian blade still lodged in her side. The skeleton of a pregnant woman was found with the remains of her unborn child inside her, as if even the womb had not been spared. These were not the dead of disease or hunger. These were victims. Every detail at Nataruk tells a story of violence. A stone point stuck in a man's neck vertebrae, another embedded in a skull. Fractures that could only have come from clubs or spears. The attackers had come prepared, armed with weapons of volcanic glass that could slice through flesh and bone. They struck quickly and without mercy, leaving behind not a battlefield but a crime scene. It is as if time itself stopped at the moment of impact and never started again. When scientists uncovered the site, they treated it like a murder investigation. Every bone was photographed, every position mapped. The sand had held their shapes perfectly, sealing them away from the world. There were no houses nearby, no sign of settlement, no sign of recovery. Whoever had been attacked here had been caught off guard, perhaps while resting or cooking or watching the water. They had no walls to protect them, no warning before death came running over the ridge. The strangest thing is how peaceful the place looks now. The same sun that once rose over the massacre still rises over the lake. The same wind still sweeps across the plains, whispering through the reeds. If you did not know the story, you might think it was a place of quiet beauty. But beneath that, calm is the memory of screams that will never fade. The bones at Nataruk are more than evidence. They are witnesses. They tell us that war is not a recent invention. It did not begin with kings or empires. It began here, among small groups of people living by a lake, when fear or anger or greed turned human hands into weapons. And for a few terrible moments 10,000 years ago, time itself stopped to remember it. What makes Nataruk so haunting is not just the violence, but the order within the chaos. This was not a random fight or an accident. It was deliberate. Every body found tells the same story. The people were caught by surprise, restrained, and killed with precision. Men with bound wrists, women struck down where they stood, children among the fallen. It was not two groups meeting in battle. It was one group ambushing another, wiping them out completely. This is the first clear evidence in human history of organized slaughter. Not hunting, not survival, war. When the site was first studied, scientists struggled to understand what they were seeing. For decades, researchers believed that true warfare began only after humans settled down, started farming, and built permanent homes. The logic seemed sound. War, they thought, required property and territory, things worth defending or stealing. But Nataruk broke that rule. These were hunter-gatherers. They owned almost nothing but what they could carry. Yet someone decided they had something worth killing for. It means the roots of conflict go deeper than land or wealth. They reach into something older, something inside us. The attackers at Nataruk knew what they were doing. They used obsidian points carried from far away, weapons crafted with skill and care. The strikes were aimed to kill, not to wound. Some victims were shot from a distance, others finished at close range. The pattern suggests strategy, coordination, intent. This was not rage in the moment, it was planned. Maybe they waited until dawn, when the camp was quiet. Maybe they circled from behind, cutting off escape. However it happened, it was systematic. Every movement left its mark in the bones. So why did it happen? What could drive one small group of early humans to destroy another? Some scientists believe it was a raid for resources, an early act of competition over water or food. Others think it might have been revenge, a cycle of violence that began with some earlier theft or killing. A few wonder if it was something even simpler, an attack for dominance, the same instinct seen in chimpanzees who fight rival groups to control territory. Each theory fits, and yet none of them can fully explain the cruelty frozen in that sand. What makes Nataruk unforgettable is how complete it feels. No one was spared. The killers did not loot or bury the dead. They left everything where it fell. It is as if the attack was not meant just to take something, but to erase the victims entirely, to send a message. We are here, you are gone. And that message, whispered across 10,000 years, reaches us still. When we look at Nataruk, we are not just studying bones. We are staring at the moment when humanity crossed an invisible line. The moment we learned how to turn fear into strategy, anger into planning, and survival into domination. It is the first evidence that we could look at our own kind and see not family, but enemy. For a long time, people liked to imagine that our distant ancestors lived in peace. Small bands of hunter-gatherers moving through the wilderness, sharing food, working together, guided by instinct and cooperation. The idea of the noble hunter-gatherer became almost a myth, a story we told ourselves to believe that violence came later, with greed and civilization. But the truth buried beneath places like Nataruk tells a harder story. Violence did not begin with kingdoms or crowns. It began long before. It lived in the same minds that built fire, shaped tools, and sang under the stars. The archaeological record shatters the peaceful myth. Across Africa, Europe, and the Americas, there are scattered bones that tell the same quiet truth. Broken skulls, arrow points lodged in ribs, evidence of ambushes and raids among groups that never built cities or fences. In Kenya, Sudan, and South Africa, archaeologists have found skeletons that carry the marks of weapons thousands of years before written history. These people were not soldiers. They were foragers, families. Yet they lived and died in a world where survival could turn into conflict at any moment. It makes sense when you think about it. Hunter-gatherers had no armies, but they still had territories. They still depended on the same waterholes, the same herds, the same patches of fertile land. If one group wandered too close to another's camp, if they hunted the same game or gathered from the same trees, the tension could ignite quickly. There were no maps, no treaties, just invisible boundaries drawn in memory and instinct. Cross them, and you risked your life. Even today, we see reflections of this in the last remaining forager societies. Anthropologists studying isolated groups have recorded violent clashes over resources and revenge killings between neighboring bands. Some encounters end in cooperation, others end in blood. It shows that humans are not naturally peaceful or naturally violent. We are both shaped by need and fear, capable of kindness and cruelty in equal measure. The romantic image of a gentle prehistoric world comes from our desire to believe that conflict is modern, that it came from money or power or politics. But Nataruk proves otherwise. 10,000 years ago, people who owned almost nothing still found reasons to destroy each other. They had no gold, no armies, no written laws. What they had was emotion. Fear of losing what little they had, anger at those who threatened it. The same feelings that still drive conflict today. This is not to say our ancestors were monsters. They were survivors. The same intelligence that helped them hunt also made them capable of strategy and defense. Cooperation kept them alive, but so did caution. Peace was a choice that had to be made every single day. When it failed, violence followed. The myth of peaceful hunters comforts us, but it hides something more important. That violence is not what defines humanity, but what humanity must always resist. The people at Nataruk remind us that the line between peace and war has always been thin, even when the world was still green and wild. The weapons at Nataruk were not crude tools made in a hurry. They were crafted from obsidian, a volcanic glass sharper than steel and deadlier than anything else available to early humans. Under the sunlight, obsidian looks like black water, smooth and reflective. When struck with skill, it breaks into edges so fine they can slice through flesh with almost no resistance. Finding obsidian in the bones at Nataruk told scientists something extraordinary. The nearest natural source of that material was miles away. That means the attackers carried their weapons over long distances. They planned this, they scouted, they prepared. This was not chaos, it was strategy. To make an obsidian blade, a tool maker needs patience and knowledge. You cannot just hit the stone randomly. You have to strike it at precise angles, controlling the pressure to shape flakes that can pierce or cut. Each weapon found at the site showed signs of expert craftsmanship. Some points were small and narrow for piercing, others were broad and heavy for smashing bone. These were not made for hunting antelope or carving wood. They were designed for combat. That alone changes how we see the people who made them. They were not just surviving. They were thinking ahead. Imagine the days before the attack. A group gathering obsidian, chipping it into points, attaching them to shafts with resin and animal sinew. Talking quietly around a fire, deciding when to move, where to strike, how to approach the lake without being seen. That level of coordination requires communication, memory, and trust. It means they understood their environment deeply. They knew which paths to take, where their targets would be camped, and how to use the terrain to their advantage. In every way that matters, this was a planned operation. The presence of distant obsidian also hints at connections between regions. It suggests trade or travel routes across the ancient landscape, routes that carried not only materials, but ideas and technology. Someone had to know where to find the stone, someone had to bring it, and someone had to teach others how to use it. Knowledge was power, and at Nataruk, that power was turned toward destruction. The damage on the skeletons reveals the effectiveness of those weapons. Some cuts were clean and sharp, the kind made by fast, controlled strikes. Others were deep fractures caused by heavy blows. The combination of ranged attacks from spears and close combat wounds shows a pattern of tactical behavior. They did not stumble into this confrontation. They surrounded, overwhelmed, and finished their targets. This discovery forces us to rethink how intelligent and organized early humans really were. They did not need cities or armies to plan violence. They already understood timing, precision, and cooperation. The obsidian points at Nataruk are more than artifacts. They are fingerprints of the first generals, the first tacticians, the first minds to turn technology into a weapon of war. When you hold one in your hand, polished and dark, You are holding a piece of thought sharpened into stone, proof that the roots of human strategy run as deep as our desire to survive. At first glance, the land around Lake Turkana seems endless, but 10,000 years ago, it was a place where every drop of water and every stretch of shoreline could mean the difference between life and death. The people who lived here depended on the lake completely. It gave them fish, animals to hunt, and plants to gather. It was the center of their world. When the climate began to change, that world started to shrink. The rains that once came every year began to falter. The grasslands dried, rivers turned to dust. The lake receded, leaving cracked mud and shrinking pools behind. Suddenly, survival was not about skill alone. It was about control, and control over water meant power. Imagine small groups scattered along the edge of the lake, each one fighting to keep access to the few remaining fertile spots. They built temporary shelters near the water, moving only when the land failed them. But every time they moved, they risked crossing into another group's territory. What began as cautious distance became guarded boundaries, and guarded boundaries turned into violent confrontations. To take water was to take life, and that made it worth fighting for. The same lake that connected these people became the reason they learned to see one another as threats. Scientists studying ancient Turkana have found that changes in rainfall and temperature around this time were extreme. Lakes rose and fell dramatically, sometimes over a single lifetime. For communities living at the edge of survival, these shifts would have been devastating. When fish stocks collapsed or herds moved away, desperation followed, and desperation changes the rules. A camp running low on food might see a neighboring camp not as allies but as competitors. They might plan a raid, not out of cruelty, but out of the logic of survival. This is what makes the violence at Nataruk so complex. It was not chaos. It was a negotiation written in blood. When resources grow scarce, aggression becomes a language. Taking control of the lake's richest fishing grounds could mean generations of security. Losing it could mean extinction. So groups calculated the risks. They chose the timing of their attacks, picked their targets carefully, and struck when the balance of power favored them. It was brutal, but it was strategic. The logic of violence is simple and ancient. When nature stops giving freely, humans start taking by force. The more precious the resource, the more dangerous the competition becomes. At Lake Turkana, that logic was carved into the bones of those who fell. Each fracture, each wound, each abandoned body was part of a grim transaction. Power was measured not in gold or land, but in the right to drink, fish, and live another day. Even now, when you look at the shimmering water under the desert sun, it is hard to believe such beauty could have driven such cruelty. But water has always been both gift and curse. It gives life, but it also teaches us how far we will go to keep it. 10,000 years ago, the land around Lake Turkana was alive with movement. Small groups of people travelled with the seasons, setting up camps wherever water and food could be found. They were not wanderers without purpose. Each band knew the land intimately. They followed animal trails, knew where fruit trees ripened, and remembered which stretches of shoreline stayed wet the longest. Their lives were woven into the rhythm of the lake. Camps were made from simple shelters of wood and grass. Fires burned through the night, while families cooked fish and shared stories about where to move next. These were tight communities, built on blood ties and trust, but they were never truly alone. Beyond the horizon, other groups lived and moved too, and between them ran invisible lines of connection and danger. Sometimes those lines meant trade. Groups exchanged goods that could not be found nearby. Obsidian from distant volcanic ridges, shells from the far side of the lake, dried fish, animal hides, or beads carved from bone. Trade built relationships, and those relationships mattered. They brought news, partners, and protection. People intermarried between groups, creating bonds that could last generations. A man's cousins might live across the water. A woman's brother might travel to another camp during the dry season. These family ties turned Turkana into a living network of shared survival. But the same network carried tension. The closer the groups lived to one another, the easier it was for cooperation to become competition. When a fishing ground ran empty or an animal herd changed its route, someone lost access to resources. Accusations followed. Someone took too much. Someone crossed a border they were not supposed to. A shared watering hole could become a spark. Old alliances could break overnight. The people around Turkana understood this risk. They likely held gatherings to renew friendships and settle disputes, maybe through trade feasts or marriages that joined rival clans. Yet beneath the laughter and the music of wooden drums, there was always an undercurrent of caution. Everyone remembered stories of raids and revenge. Everyone knew that a single insult or a stolen animal could bring trouble. These were small communities, but memory was long, and grudges could last generations. Archaeologists studying the region found evidence that these groups knew each other's territories well. They followed seasonal routes that often crossed paths, leaving behind traces of fire pits, tools, and fishing gear. Their world was connected like a web, flexible but fragile. When one thread broke, the rest trembled. It was within this web that the massacre at Nataruk happened, not as an isolated event, but as part of a larger pattern of alliances, betrayals, and shifting loyalties. One camp may have risen in strength, another fallen into weakness. The killers were not strangers. They were part of the same human network, bound by trade, kinship, and conflict. The tragedy of Nataruk was born not from isolation, but from connection. The web that held these early communities together was the same one that tore them apart. When the team of scientists first arrived at Nataruk, they did not see a battlefield. They saw a stretch of dry land near Lake Turkana, cracked and empty under the sun. It took years of patience and precision to reveal what was hidden below. Every grain of sand had to be brushed away carefully, every piece of bone mapped and recorded. What began as a handful of fragments turned into a story written in the earth. The sediment became a witness, holding memories that had been sealed for 10,000 years. The process started with excavation. Scientists marked off the area into grids and began digging layer by layer, recording the depth and position of every find. Bones that had not seen daylight in thousands of years began to emerge, fragile and pale against the dark soil. The remains were so well preserved that even small details survived, like the shape of a finger bone or the thin edge of an obsidian blade. The scientists worked slowly, using brushes, dental tools, and wooden sticks instead of shovels. One wrong move could destroy evidence that had waited millennia to be seen again. Once the bones were exposed, they were photographed and scanned. Every fracture, every cut, every embedded stone was documented. It was like piecing together a puzzle with half the pieces missing. Microscopic analysis helped reveal what the naked eye could not. Under magnification, scientists could see the clean edges of sharp force trauma, the impact marks of blunt weapons, and the fine cracks that showed where bones had broken before burial. Each mark told part of the story, turning silence into testimony. To find out when the massacre happened, the team turned to radiocarbon dating. Tiny samples of bone and sediment were tested for traces of carbon isotopes that decay at a known rate. The results placed the event around 10,000 years ago, long before agriculture or cities existed. That number changed everything. It pushed the origins of organized violence far deeper into human history than anyone had expected. Even the surrounding soil helped fill in the story. Layers of sediment showed that the area had once been a shallow lagoon. Fish bones and shells mixed with human remains confirmed that the victims had lived by the water. The sand that covered them was laid down gently, suggesting they were buried by natural flooding rather than by human hands. This explained why the scene had stayed so perfectly preserved. Nature had sealed it, like a time capsule. When the excavation ended, the scientists stepped back and looked at what they had uncovered. They were not just studying bones anymore. They were reading the last moments of real people, frozen in place by time and chance. Each skeleton became a chapter in the same story, each tool and weapon a clue. The evidence turned the ground into a record, and that record became a voice. Through science, the dead at Nataruk spoke again, telling us what happened on that ancient shore when the first war in human history began. When the scientists examined the bones at Nataruk, it was like watching the end of a tragedy unfold in slow motion. Every skeleton carried a story of those final moments. There was no confusion in the evidence, no hint of accident. It was organized, deliberate, and cruel. The first body they studied was that of a man. His wrists were pulled behind his back, bound tightly together before death. The bones of his arms were twisted, locked in a position no living person could hold for long. His skull had been struck with a heavy object, the impact so strong it shattered bone and left fragments driven deep into the soil. He never had a chance to fight back. The ropes around his hands told the truth more clearly than words ever could. He was captured, restrained, and executed. Nearby lay a woman. Her body curled on one side as if she had fallen trying to shield herself. The scientists discovered she had been heavily pregnant. The remains of her unborn child were still inside her pelvis, perfectly preserved in the dry sand. She had been struck across the face and ribs, the pattern of fractures showing she was attacked at close range. No sign of struggle, no sign of escape. Whoever killed her knew exactly what they were doing. The violence was personal. It was not random or wild. It was meant to erase. A few feet away, they found the skeleton of a child, no older than 6 or 7. The child's small skull had a deep fracture at the back, the kind caused by a sudden, powerful blow. There were no defensive injuries, no broken arms or signs of resistance. The attacker came from behind. The strike was clean, efficient, a final. It is hard to imagine that scene without feeling the weight of it. The people who carried out this act did not stop at the strong or the armed. They targeted everyone. The more the scientists uncovered, the clearer the pattern became. One man had multiple wounds, both from sharp blades and blunt weapons. Another had a projectile point still buried in his neck vertebra. These were coordinated attacks, not chance killings. The attackers had moved quickly, cutting down their victims one by one. It was not a raid to scare or warn. It was meant to destroy. What is chilling is how familiar it all feels. Even across 10,000 years, the marks of intent are unmistakable. The bound hands, the strikes to the head, the silence left afterward. It is the same pattern seen in every organized act of violence since. Planning, precision, total lack of mercy. Nataruk is not just a story about bones. It is a portrait of cruelty in its purest form. For the first time, humans used their intelligence not only to survive nature, but to dominate each other completely. The victims could not speak, but their remains recorded every second of that terrible day. Murder in slow motion, preserved forever beneath the sand. It is early morning 10,000 years ago. The first light of dawn spreads over the calm water of a shallow lagoon near Lake Turkana. Mist drifts across the surface, soft and white, curling around clusters of reeds. A small camp sleeps beside the shore. Watch fires burn low, their smoke rising in thin grey threads. The people here have been awake most of the night, tending fires, repairing nets, and talking quietly. Now they rest. The air smells of wet grass and fish. A few canoes sit half pulled onto the mud, rocking gently as small waves touch the shore. The lake looks peaceful, but just beyond the haze, shadows move. The attackers have been watching since before dawn. They came on foot, moving carefully along the ridge that overlooks the water. They carry clubs, spears, and long shafts tipped with obsidian points that catch the first light like shards of glass. They know this camp. They have studied its patterns. When the fires are lowest, when the guards drift into half, sleep, when the fog is thickest, that is when they strike. Some wait behind rocks and dry shrubs. Others slip closer through the tall grass, their feet soundless in the damp earth. It is not a battle, it is an ambush. At the edge of the camp, a man steps out of a shelter, yawning, unaware. He bends to wash his face in the lagoon. That is when the first spear flies. It hits him in the chest, and before he can cry out, another follows. The sound of impact breaks the silence like a drumbeat. Panic spreads instantly. People scramble out of their shelters. Children scream. Women grab whatever they can carry. But the attackers are already inside the camp. Some come from the shore, wading through the water, using canoes to cut off escape. Others rush from behind, shouting and striking. The fog becomes chaos. The smell of smoke mixes with blood. A woman tries to run toward the water, but falls as an obsidian blade slices through her side. A man raises his hands in surrender, only to be struck from behind. A child hides beneath a canoe, silent and still, as the world ends around them. It does not last long. The attackers move with precision. They are not there to chase or steal. They are there to eliminate. When the noise fades, only the wind remains, whispering across the reeds. The lagoon reflects the sky again, unbothered, calm, as if nothing had happened. The bodies lie where they fell. The fires burn out. The attackers disappear into the hills, leaving no trace except the weapons that broke or lodged in bone. Thousands of years later, when scientists uncovered this place, they found the story frozen in the ground. Each skeleton, each blade, each broken fragment of bone was part of that morning. The evidence fits together like frames in a silent film. It was not fantasy, it was real. An ambush at the edge of a lagoon when the sun rose over Lake Turkana and the first light of day revealed what humans had become. 10,000 years ago, there was no one to call for help. No guards on the horizon, no villages nearby, no courts, no laws, no armies to enforce peace. The people who lived around Lake Turkana were completely alone in the world. When danger came, there was no higher power to stop it. The only protection you had was the strength of your family and the people standing beside you. Justice was not written on paper. It was carried in memory, in loyalty, in revenge. If someone wronged you, it was up to you to make it right. That was the rule, and everyone understood it. In this world, fear was never far away. Every stranger could be a friend or an enemy. Every shadow beyond the firelight might hide a hunter or a rival. Life depended on reading people quickly, judging their intentions before they spoke. Trust had to be earned again and again, because one mistake could cost an entire group their lives. There were no walls to hide behind, no safe places that lasted for long. Even the most peaceful moments carried a quiet tension, the knowledge that safety was only temporary. The isolation of these small camps changed the way people thought about conflict. Without outside help, every decision had to be made inside the group. If a member was killed, the others had to respond, not because they wanted to, but because doing nothing invited more attacks. If someone stole food or water, they had to strike back to prove they could not be taken lightly. Violence became a form of communication, a language of survival. To show weakness was to risk extinction, so people learned to act first. Imagine living in that world. You wake up each morning knowing that everything you have could be gone by nightfall. You depend on your family for safety, but they depend on you too. The children watch the adults closely, learning how to spot danger, how to react without hesitation. Even kindness has limits. You might share food with a stranger one day and drive them away the next if they linger too long. It is not cruelty, it is calculation. This isolation made communities strong, but also fragile. Inside the group, cooperation was everything. People hunted together, shared food, cared for the sick. But outside the group, loyalty ended. The line between us and them was sharp and unforgiving, and once violence began, there was no one to stop it. One raid could spark another. A death could demand revenge. The cycle could last generations. When the massacre at Nataruk happened, the victims had no way to call for help. No reinforcements were coming. The only witnesses were the wind and the water. Their deaths were final because the world they lived in offered no rescue and no justice beyond what humans could make for themselves. It was a world both beautiful and brutal, where survival meant being ready to fight before anyone else decided to fight you. For most of history, people believed that war began with civilization. The story went like this. Once humans started farming, building homes, and storing food, they created wealth. Wealth created jealousy, jealousy created conflict, and conflict became war. It made sense. War seemed like the price of progress. But Nataruk changed that story completely. The massacre on the shores of Lake Turkana happened around 10,000 years ago, long before the first farms, long before villages or kings or armies. These people were not defending fields or gold. They were foragers. They lived in small bands that moved with the seasons, carrying little more than what they could hold. Yet they planned, ambushed, and killed as effectively as any organized force in history. The shock of that discovery rippled through science, because it meant war did not come from property, it came from people. The bones at Nataruk tell a story written before civilization even existed. These were humans living at the edge of nature, still fully part of it, yet capable of violence, as deliberate and systematic as anything seen today. They had no walls to protect them, no leaders giving orders, and no written language to justify their actions. But they understood strategy, fear, and revenge. They turned tools meant for hunting animals into weapons for hunting each other. This was not chaos. It was intelligence applied to destruction. When scientists first confirmed the age of the site, many hesitated to believe it. How could people without permanent homes have reason to fight so brutally? What was there to gain? The answer lies in survival. Even before farming, humans had something worth protecting: water sources, food stores, mates, territory. These were the foundations of power long before crops or cities. The people at Nataruk fought not for wealth, but for continuity, for the right to live and to keep living in a world that offered no guarantees. This discovery forces us to look deeper into human nature. If war existed before farming, before ownership, before civilization, then it is not just a product of society. It is part of the machinery of survival that shaped our species. The same brain that invented cooperation also invented conflict. The same hands that built fires also raised weapons. The urge to defend, to attack, to dominate may have evolved alongside empathy and curiosity. Both sides of our nature were born together. That realization is uncomfortable. We want to believe that war is something we created, something we can unmake if we just become wiser. But the bones at Nataruk whisper otherwise. They tell us that violence is not a side effect of progress. It is a shadow that has always followed us, even when we lived in huts by a lake instead of cities of glass and steel. 10,000 years before the first farmer sowed a seed, someone raised a spear against their own kind. War is older than agriculture, older than writing, older than history itself. It was not born from what we built, it was born from what we are. We often imagine territory as something marked by walls and fences. But 10,000 years ago, the people around Lake Turkana defended something far less visible. Their borders were made not of stone, but of memory. They did not own land the way farmers would thousands of years later, but they knew every inch of their world. They knew where the fish were most plentiful, which streams still held water when the rest of the land turned dry, and which paths led safely through the hills. These were their soft territories, invisible to outsiders, but deeply meaningful to those who lived there. To lose access to these places was to lose the right to survive, and survival, even then, was worth killing for. Every group that lived along the lake had its own map, not drawn on paper but carried in their minds. They knew where to find obsidian, where herds of antelope crossed, where fruit trees grew, and where it was safest to camp during the dry season. These routes and resources were shared through stories and passed down through generations. A child might learn from a parent that a certain bend in the river was home to crocodiles, or that a specific ridge offered shelter from the wind. Knowledge was territory. To share it was to show trust. To guard it was to show power. When another group crossed into those invisible borders, it was more than trespass. It was a challenge. Even without formal ownership, people understood whose camp stood where, whose fishing nets hung from which reeds, and whose footprints marked the trail. At first, these encounters might have started with warnings or displays of strength, a shouted threat, a raised weapon, a chase. But as resources grew scarce and tempers hardened, those warnings turned into bloodshed. Archaeologists studying the region believe the people at Nataruk were part of this kind of system. They lived near a lagoon that would have been rich in fish, fresh water, and edible plants. It was prime territory, especially during a time when drought and climate shifts made survival unpredictable. It is easy to imagine that another group, struggling to find food elsewhere, saw that lagoon as opportunity. They would not have seen themselves as invaders. They would have seen it as reclaiming what nature had offered to all. But to the people living there, it was theft, a threat, an unforgivable act. Even today, the same logic echoes across the world. People still fight over resources, space, and control, even when the borders are invisible. 10,000 years ago, those conflicts just took simpler forms. No cities, no armies, just people defending their place in the world the only way they could. The soil at Nataruk held no walls, but it held boundaries all the same. Boundaries written not in stone or wood, but in memory and blood. To the people who lived there, that was enough to fight for, and enough to die for. To understand what happened at Nataruk, you have to imagine not just the bodies on the ground, but the thoughts in the minds of those who struck the blows. These were not monsters or mindless killers. They were humans, thinking, feeling, and reasoning in ways that would seem familiar, even now. The same intelligence that let them plan hunts and build alliances also allowed them to plan an ambush. The The same instincts that helped them protect their families drove them to destroy others. The massacre at Lake Turkana was not just a physical act. It was psychological. It came from the parts of the human mind built to cooperate, to predict danger, and to survive in a world that did not forgive mistakes. Fear was the spark. Fear of losing food, fear of betrayal, fear of another group growing stronger. Fear makes the human brain plan ahead. It forces imagination, the ability to picture future threats before they happen. But that imagination cuts both ways. It lets us create tools, languages, and shelter. It also lets us invent enemies, see danger where there is none, and strike before being struck. The people who attacked the camp at Nataruk were not acting on chaos, they were acting on anticipation. In their minds, they were preventing loss before it happened. Then there was projection. Humans are experts at reading emotion and motive. We see patterns in every face, hear intention in every voice. It is what makes empathy possible, but it also creates suspicion. When we fear others, our minds fill in the blanks. We assume hostility, we assign blame, we convince ourselves that our violence is defense. The killers at Nataruk may have believed they were protecting their own families. They may have seen their victims not as people, but as threats. That is how the human mind turns fear into justification. Coalition building made it possible. No one person could have carried out such a coordinated attack alone. It required trust and loyalty within the attacking group. Humans are wired for collaboration. We form alliances easily, share goals, and synchronize our actions. That ability has made our species unstoppable. It has also made us dangerous. When cooperation meets hostility, it becomes organized brutality. Togetherness gives strength, and strength can be used for either creation or destruction. The same unity that builds villages can also burn them. Every mark on the bones at Nataruk is evidence of those mental tools at work: planning, communication, strategy, shared purpose. Each of these evolved to help us survive, and yet here they fueled the first recorded slaughter. It is a chilling truth that our intelligence is not purely a force for good. It magnifies whatever we decide to do, whether that is raising a shelter or raising a weapon. The minds behind the blows at Nataruk were not primitive, they were human. And what they left behind is proof that our greatest strength and our darkest instincts have always lived side by side, born from the same spark that made us who we are. The massacre at Nataruk might seem like an isolated tragedy, a rare act of ancient cruelty buried beneath the sands of Kenya. But when scientists began to look beyond the lake, they started finding echoes of the same story scattered across the world. Far from being an anomaly, Nataruk was part of a much older pattern, one written quietly into human history long before cities, kings, or armies existed. Across continents, other groups of early humans had also turned their intelligence toward organized killing. In Europe, thousands of years after Nataruk, archaeologists uncovered a mass grave at a site called Talheim in Germany. Inside were the remains of more than 30 people, men, women, and children, all killed by blows to the head. Their wounds matched weapons made from stone axes and clubs. They had been attacked suddenly, wiped out as an entire community, then buried together in a pit. The attackers took nothing. It was not about loot, it was about elimination. The bones told the same story seen at Nataruk, the same logic of fear, rivalry, and control. In South America, on the banks of ancient Andean valleys, skeletons show similar marks. Arrow points embedded in ribs, skulls crushed by blunt tools, signs of people ambushed while gathering food or water. Thousands of miles away and thousands of years apart, the pattern repeats. The methods differ, but the motive is constant. groups competing for space, food, or power, bound by loyalty to their own and suspicion of everyone else. Even in ancient Australia, evidence points to conflict among hunter-gatherer communities. Cave paintings show figures with spears facing off in formation. Some of the earliest burials carry weapons driven through bone, silent proof that organized violence stretched across oceans and eras. On islands, in forests, across deserts, the same story emerges. People fighting not for empires, but for survival, pride, or revenge. Scientists studying prehistoric sites now recognize that Naturuk was not an exception, but a reminder. It shows that wherever humans went, the potential for conflict followed. Violence was not born in one place. It was part of a shared inheritance. Every culture, from the Arctic to the tropics, carries traces of this ancient behavior passed through generations like the stories told around campfires. But these echoes also reveal something else. Alongside violence came cooperation, art, and care for the dead. Even in places marked by battle, archaeologists find signs of healing, of people who survived wounds because others tended to them. Humanity's story has always balanced destruction and compassion side by side. Naturuk is just one chapter in that larger book. When you look at all these sites together, a clear picture forms. War did not start with civilization. It began with us. Wherever we went, whoever we were, the first blades were raised not by soldiers, but by people who looked out across the same sunlit landscapes and made the same terrible choice. The echoes of Naturuk stretch across continents, a quiet pattern carved into the bones of our species. Along the shores of Lake Turkana, life was never just about fear and fighting. The same people who carried obsidian blades and guarded their water sources also traded, shared, and fell in love. The camps that dotted the landscape were not only rivals. They were partners too, bound together by family ties and fragile trust. It is easy to imagine these early humans as always at war, but the truth is more complicated. Their world existed in a constant balance between hospitality and hostility. Sometimes they welcomed each other. Sometimes they struck without warning. Both sides of that story are written in the earth. On calm days, the lake would have shimmered like glass, its edge lined with fishing nets and canoes. Travelers might arrive from across the water carrying baskets of dried fish or obsidian flakes traded from distant ridges. They were greeted cautiously, but not with violence. Trade mattered. It connected people who would otherwise have been strangers. One group might have salt, another might have hides or tools. Exchanges like these built relationships, and relationships meant safety. When two groups met and shared gifts, they shared information too. Where the herds had moved, where the rains had fallen, who had been seen along the trails. These small acts of trust helped everyone survive. Marriage worked the same way. When families joined through marriage, alliances formed. A woman leaving her home to live with another group could become a bridge between two communities. Her children carried both lineages. Through her, peace could last a generation or two. It was a human solution to the tension that came with proximity. The same instinct that taught people to fight also taught them to bond. But that balance was fragile. A bad season, a drought, or a broken promise could turn friendship into suspicion overnight. The same canoes that carried traders could carry raiders. A familiar face could become a threat. There were no permanent borders, no written agreements to hold peace in place. Everything depended on memory and reputation. One theft, one betrayal, could erase years of cooperation. Archaeologists have found evidence of this duality at multiple sites around the lake. Tools from distant regions suggest trade networks, while nearby graves show violent deaths. The same communities that exchanged goods also fought for control of the best fishing grounds. That contradiction is not unique to ancient Turkana. It runs through the whole human story. We build bridges and borders at the same time. When you picture those early people meeting at the edge of the lagoon, you can almost feel the tension in the air, a cautious smile, a hand resting near a weapon. A gift offered, but never without calculation. They lived in a world where kindness and caution walked side by side. Hospitality could open a door, but hostility could close it forever. In the reflection of Lake Turkana, both sides of human nature stared back, and neither could exist without the other. Most acts of violence in the ancient world vanished without a trace. Bones rot, tools break, rain and wind erase everything. Time is ruthless, swallowing evidence faster than we can imagine. That is why Nataruk is so rare. It is not just a story of early human conflict, it is a miracle of survival. The massacre there could easily have disappeared like all the others, but the earth kept it. The lake shifted just enough to cover the site in fine silt, sealing the bones in oxygen-poor mud. The same water that may have drawn the victims to that place ended up protecting their story for 10,000 years. Without that accident of nature, we would never have known any of it happened. When archaeologists dig through layers of soil, they are not uncovering everything that ever was. They are finding the smallest fraction of what survived by chance. For every site like Nataruk that endures, hundreds more have been erased. Fires burned the camps, floods swept away the dead. Animals scattered bones across open ground. Most violence leaves only memory, and memories die with the people who carry them. What we see in the archaeological record is not the full picture. It is the outline of a much larger world, most of which is gone. That is why scientists call Nataruk a window rather than a monument. Through it, we glimpse one terrible moment frozen in time, but beyond that moment stretches a silence we cannot measure. How many other massacres happened along the lake's shores? How many raids ended with no survivors left to bury the dead? How many groups vanished entirely without leaving a trace? The soil keeps its secrets, and those secrets remind us that history is not fair. It remembers what chance allows it to remember. Even in later periods, when people built villages and farmed the land, entire conflicts disappeared within a few generations. Wood rots, flesh decays, stones are reused. Only under perfect conditions does death become permanent enough to speak again. At Nataruk, the desert and the lake worked together to preserve not just bones, but emotion. You can still see the posture of a body mid-fall, still trace the cuts of blades that struck in panic or precision. It feels impossible that so much survived, but even more impossible that so much more did not. The silence in archaeology is not empty, it is heavy. It carries the weight of everything that happened but left no record. The massacre at Nataruk is one page from a book mostly lost to time. A single scene from a long play whose actors have vanished. When we study it, we are hearing an echo of thousands of other voices that never reached us. Their stories ended in the same way, under the same sun, along the same waters, but the earth closed over them too soon. The tragedy of Nataruk is that it is not unique. The tragedy of history is that it is the only one we can still hear. Every night at Nataruk, long before the massacre, there would have been fires burning beside the lake, families huddled close, children listening to stories, elders watching the darkness. Around those flames, the world felt small and safe. Inside the circle was us, the people you trusted, the ones who shared food, laughter, and danger. Beyond the circle was everything else. The unknown, the unpredictable, them. That idea, that invisible boundary between us and them, may be the oldest human invention of all. Long before cities or nations or religion, the people at Nataruk already lived inside those lines. The human brain is built for belonging. We depend on groups for protection, for knowledge, for survival. Being part of a community gives meaning to our lives, but it also shapes how we see the world. When you define who belongs, you also define who does not. That division can be small at first. It might start with who speaks your language or who camps beside your fire. But as time passes, those differences grow heavier. They start to feel like truth, like nature. The people on the other side of the water stop being just different. They become dangerous. Psychologists call this in-group bias. It is not something we learn, it is something we inherit. Our ancestors survived by forming tight alliances, trusting only those who proved loyal. The cost of trusting the wrong person could be death, so our minds evolved to sort people quickly, to build categories that made survival faster and safer. In a harsh world, this instinct worked, but it came with a dark price. Once you divide the world into us and them, almost anything becomes possible. The massacre at Nataruk was that instinct written in blood. The attackers did not see individuals. They saw outsiders, rivals, threats to their survival. In their minds, killing them was not cruelty. It was justice. It was defense. That is how the boundary between community and conflict is drawn so easily. The same circle of safety that kept families alive also cast the longest shadows. Even now, tens of thousands of years later, the same pattern repeats. The details have changed, but the psychology has not. We still form circles of belonging, still build walls around identity. Whether those walls are made of language, belief, or skin, the impulse behind them is ancient. It comes from the same minds that once looked across a lagoon and saw enemies where there might have been neighbors. At Nataruk, we can see the beginning of that story. A camp destroyed because the people on one side of the fire saw the people on the other as less than human. It is not a story about monsters. It is a story about us. The first sparks of loyalty, fear, and unity flickering in the firelight. The circle of warmth that defines who we are, and the darkness it creates just beyond its reach. Lake Turkana has been called the cradle of humankind, and for good reason. Along its shifting shores, the bones of our ancestors have been rising from the earth for more than a century. From Homo erectus to Homo sapiens, the story of our species is written in its sediments. Every discovery pulled from that soil has revealed another chapter of who we are and how we came to be. But Turkana is more than a cradle. It is also a mirror, one that reflects both our brilliance and our brutality. It has seen humans take their first steps toward cooperation and their first steps toward violence. It remembers everything, even when we forget. 10,000 years ago, the lake looked different, but its presence carried the same power. Its waters shimmered like a promise in the dry landscape. It gave life to every creature that lived near it. Fish swam through its shallows, birds gathered in flocks, and hippos carved paths through reeds that reached the sky. For the people who lived there, it was both provider and protector. Yet just as easily, it could turn against them. Droughts could shrink it. Floods could erase entire camps. The lake gave life, but it also demanded balance. That dual nature made it the perfect stage for the story of Nataruk. The same waters that sustained those early people became the reason for their destruction. The lake was too important, too valuable to share without fear. Its abundance created both community and conflict. Around its edges, families built homes, traded goods, and celebrated life. But on another day, those same shores witnessed death and silence. Turkana has always been that way, both cradle and courtroom, where the best and worst of human nature are judged by time. Scientists who study its layers describe the lake as a vast archive. The sediments record everything, from volcanic ash that marks ancient eruptions to the pollen of vanished plants. Even the smallest grains tell stories about shifting climates and changing lives. In that sense, Turkana is not just a place, it is a witness. It watched our ancestors learn to make fire, to craft tools, to speak, to dream, and it watched them turn those same gifts into weapons. When you stand on its shore today, the wind carries a strange feeling. It is both ancient and alive. The same water that once reflected the faces of early humans still moves in slow waves. Somewhere beneath it lie the traces of those who came before us, the ones who laughed, hunted, and died by its edge. Lake Turkana has seen more of humanity than any history book ever could. It has seen us at our most fragile and our most fearless. It reminds us that the story of humankind has never been one of purity or perfection. It is a story of survival, written in silt and bone, in kindness and cruelty alike. The lake does not judge, but it remembers. And through it, so do we. When you look at the obsidian blades from Nataruk, it is impossible not to see their reflection in modern weapons. The shape is different, the material sharper, the reach longer, but the purpose is the same. Each one was made by human hands, guided by the same thoughts and the same fears. The people who struck with those black glass points were not so different from the ones who pulled triggers today. The technology has changed, but the reasons have not. Fear, survival, revenge, and status. Those motives echo through every century, carried forward like a pattern written into our species. In the ancient world, a hunter could spend days shaping a single spear point. Every strike of the stone was deliberate. Every edge mattered. It took patience and precision, the same kind of focus that a modern engineer might use to design a drone or a missile. The goal is still the same, to make something that gives an advantage in conflict. The tool is only an extension of the mind that created it. 10,000 years ago, it was obsidian. Now it is steel, uranium, and code. But behind every weapon is a human face, and behind that face is the same calculation. How to survive, how to win, how to make sure it is them and not us. The people who fought at Nataruk did not have nations or armies, but they understood power. Controlling water, territory, or resources gave them influence and safety. The same principles drive modern wars. Oil fields, farmland, trade routes, borders. We like to believe that our conflicts are more complex, shaped by politics or ideology, but beneath those layers, the same primal motives live on. Groups still fight to secure what they believe is theirs. They still fear scarcity. They still seek revenge for old wounds. The reasons are ancient, even if the weapons are not. There is something haunting in the thought that the same intelligence that builds civilizations also perfects the tools that can destroy them. At Nataruk, that intelligence made sharp edges from volcanic glass. Today, it builds machines that can level cities from miles away. Both inventions required creativity, cooperation, and imagination. Both grew from the same hands that learned to paint caves, weave baskets, and carve music from bone. Our ability to create and our capacity for violence are two sides of the same mind. When you see modern soldiers marching across deserts or drones, circling over distant landscapes, you are looking at the same story played again, with brighter lights and louder sounds. The faces have changed, but the expressions are familiar. determination, fear, grief, hope. Those emotions have never left us. The lesson in Naturuk is not only about death. It is about continuity. We are still the same species, still carrying the same instincts that first drew lines in the dust around a campfire. Technology has given us reach, but it has not changed our reflection. The hands that hold our weapons are ancient, and so are the reasons they close around them. When you look across Lake Turkana today, it is hard not to wonder if we have really moved on. The water still shimmers under the same sun that once rose over the bodies at Naturuk. The wind still hums through the dry reeds, carrying whispers that sound like memory. We have built cities, written laws, invented languages to speak of justice and peace, but beneath it all, the same human brain remains. The one that planned the ambush 10,000 years ago is the one planning conflicts now. Our tools have changed. Our excuses have changed, but our instincts have not. Every generation believes it is more civilized than the last. We build courts to replace revenge, governments to replace tribes, and treaties to replace fear. We say we have evolved beyond brutality, yet our history keeps repeating itself. Wars erupt, borders harden, and the same cycle begins again. We invent words like security, deterrence, or strategy to make our violence sound reasonable. But the motives at the core still come from that ancient place in the mind, the place that divides the world into us and them, the place that measures safety in power and peace in control. Think about it. The weapons may now reach across oceans, but the thoughts behind them could fit inside a single human skull, the same rush of fear, the same rush of anger, the same calculation about risk and survival. The difference is scale. At Naturuk, a few dozen people decided the fate of their neighbours. Today, those decisions are made in rooms that glow with screens and maps, but the heartbeat driving them is the same: the desire to feel safe by making others afraid. Our laws and religions have tried to tame this instinct. They teach compassion, forgiveness, and restraint, and often they succeed. Humanity has shown enormous capacity for kindness and empathy, but those qualities live side by side with the shadows that shaped us. When conditions break down, when fear returns, the old instincts rise again. We see it in riots, invasions, and the quiet cruelty of everyday life. Civilization may polish our reflection, but beneath the surface, the same shape stares back. Standing on the shore of Turkana, it is easy to imagine those early humans watching the water, believing their struggles were unique, their fears singular. They could not have known that 10,000 years later, others would stand in their place, asking the same questions. Are we any different? Have we truly learned? Or have we only built bigger tools for the same ancient struggle? The lake offers no answer, it only reflects. In its still surface, we can see both the beauty and the danger of what we are. The truth is unsettling. We have crossed oceans, climbed mountains, and touched the stars. But in the quiet moments, when the world grows tense again, we still stand on that same shore, staring at the same horizon, wondering who will strike first. For every act of violence written in the sand at Naturuk, there was also the chance for something different. The same hands that shaped obsidian into weapons could just as easily have shaped it into tools for building, carving, or sharing. The same minds that planned an ambush could plan a rescue. The same instincts that bound a group together for war could bind them together for peace. Violence may be part of our story, but so is compassion. We carry both, and both are ancient. Archaeologists have found signs of care buried beside signs of cruelty. In caves and river valleys around the world, skeletons show evidence of healed wounds. Someone tended those injuries. Someone stayed to feed and protect the weak when it would have been easier to leave them behind. That is proof that empathy has always been here too. It is as old as fear. It may even be older. The people who survived harsh climates and long migrations did not do it through violence alone. They survived because they learned to cooperate. They shared food, tools, and trust. They built alliances that stretched beyond bloodlines. Even at Lake Turkana, it is likely that other groups chose peace over conflict. Not every meeting ended in blood. Some ended in trade, friendship, or marriage. They exchanged fish for tools, stories for safety, and promises for peace. That same ability still drives us today. It is what allows strangers to risk their lives for others, what builds hospitals in war zones, and what makes nations sign treaties after centuries of fighting. The impulse to destroy is strong, but the impulse to rebuild is just as powerful. The difference between the two is choice. Every generation stands in the same sand, facing the same decision. Do we use our intelligence to protect or to dominate? Do we let fear shape our future, or do we trust that cooperation will carry us further? The answer has never been simple, and maybe it never will be. But history shows that when humans choose to work together, they create more than they destroy. From stone tools to spaceflight, every great leap forward has come from collaboration, not conquest. Imagine the people at Nataruk before the attack, sitting by the water, laughing, teaching, sharing food. They had the same capacity for care that we do. Somewhere nearby, others had the same capacity for hate. Both lived side by side, waiting to be chosen. The massacre preserved one choice, but not the other. The bones tell only half the story. The rest was washed away by time, carried into silence by the lake. When we look at those remains today, we are not only seeing what humans once did, we are seeing what humans still can do. The ability to destroy is in our nature, but so is the ability to forgive, to rebuild, and to protect. The choice has always been ours, written in the sand, waiting to be read again. Today, Lake Turkana is shrinking again. The same waters that once hid the bones of Nataruk are retreating, pulling back from the shore as the desert spreads further each year. Climate change and upstream dams have altered its flow. Villages that once fished its edges now stand stranded far from the waterline. The wind that used to cool the lake carries dust instead of mist. What was once a cradle of life has become a mirror of modern struggle. As the shoreline recedes, so do the boundaries between past and present. It feels like time is folding, bringing us back to that ancient moment when survival began to twist into conflict. The people who live near Turkana today face many of the same pressures that shaped their ancestors. Drought, scarcity, competition for resources. Livestock raids and political disputes rise as the land grows harsher. The weapons are newer, but the fear is old. History is repeating itself, only this time the stakes are global. As water disappears and temperatures rise, every continent is becoming a version of that ancient lake. The forgotten war is no longer just a story buried in the sand. It is a reflection of what happens when survival and rivalry blur into the same instinct. Remembering Nataruk is not about glorifying violence. It is about recognizing it. The massacre was not an isolated event. It was a warning written in bone, a message from our ancestors about what happens when fear goes unchecked and compassion fades. Those people were us. Their minds, their choices, their instincts are still alive inside every one of us. We like to think we are wiser, that our laws and technology protect us from repeating their mistakes, but the signs suggest otherwise. Wherever water becomes scarce, tension follows. Wherever fear spreads faster than understanding, history starts to echo. Standing on the modern shore of Turkana, the silence feels heavy. The wind ripples the surface of the water, the same way it did 10,000 years ago. The lake does not judge, it only remembers. It reflects the sun and the sky and whatever stands before it. If we look closely, we can see our own faces reflected in it too. The story of the forgotten war is not just about who we were. It is about who we might become again if we do not listen. Every civilization faces its test when the water starts to fall. The choice is the same now as it was then. Compete or cooperate, fear or empathy, destruction or understanding. The bones at Naturuk remind us that the line between peace and violence is drawn not in the soil, but in the mind. The lake that once recorded the first known act of human warfare is now recording the next chapter of that same story. Whether it ends in ruin or renewal depends on what we choose to remember when we stand on the shore and see the waters pulling away once more.